Welcome, everyone. I'm Kim Krause from the Scriber Media Center, and today we'll be talking with Graham Saunders, whose book, Short Growing Seasons, will be featuring today on our chat. Welcome, Graham, and thanks for joining all of us here today.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand this meeting over to Donna, because as you and I spoke earlier, I've told you that I probably have one of the brownest thumbs in the world. You said you were going to try and convert me into having gardening, so I'm very open to the idea. And then again, Donna, if you would like to go ahead and we can conduct this.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining in. I'm Donna Mikulak, and I'm the CEO of the Scriber Public Library. And of course, today we have Graham. I'm pretty excited. We've been talking with Graham for a period of time about joining us in some of our garden sessions that we have with, we've partnered with the Scriber Senior Center, and we've had a number of sessions also with the Thunder Bay Master Gardeners to help us learn a bit more about gardening, especially in the north, for some of us who might be new to it, or some of us that have been gardening for a number of years. There's always more to learn. So Graham has an extensive background in gardening, and he's written a number of articles and book reviews for publications such as Harrowsmith, Natural Life, Weatherwise, and regional newspapers in Northern Ontario. And he has also written a weekly column titled Weatherwise in the Chronicle Journal. And he's done a number of crop and garden summaries and other discussions. And Graham's weather and climate background includes work with the Australian Weather Bureau, the Atmospheric Environment Service of Canada, and forest fire weather prediction for forest fire management terms with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. And his research includes climate change and consequences for the boreal forest, and changes in the frequency of heavy rain events and other severe weather. And he's taught meteorology and various climate-related courses at Lakehead University since 1995. And also he writes for several publications and weather, climate, Lake Superior, agriculture, and northern gardening issues, including his book, of course, Gardening with Short Growing Seasons, which he has just released a revised version that's just come out. So welcome, Graham. And you have if you would like to add anything, and we also have a slideshow presentation as well that Graham is going to share with us as well.
Well, that was longer than I wanted. What else can I say? It's a pleasure to be here today, and this is designed for the North Shore. These slides, and you'll see. I don't know. I'll just pose a question. Are people familiar with my book, the old edition, perhaps? Anybody?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, it's here and there, and today the slides are revised, but I'm going to refer to at least one or two of the photographs in the book, the original version, about 12 years ago, and how things have changed, and mostly that's for a positive direction, but we'll certainly talk about that today as we go through the slides. And so this is the photograph of the cover, and sells mostly, I think, what I tried to do with the title is capture some of the difficulties we have in the north. The growing seasons are short, but I think that as the next few slides will show that has some advantages and some not so advantaged situations. So we'll start with why you might do this. I know I'm speaking to the choir here, because if you're attending this session, you're interested in garden, probably you've done this for a long time, gardening in Scriber or where you are on the North Shore. And I put it into the 4 F's of food quality. The food out of your garden will be better than you can buy from a supermarket. And finances is a little mixed, because if you ever account for your hourly wage when you're working in your garden, you're probably not going to do so well financially. Nevertheless, once you make it and it's all producing, the savings of making a trip to the store, getting in a car and driving somewhere, running out of food, not having access to the food immediately out your door. All of those have financial implications too. A big one, I think, in my terms, is food security. And as you know, sometimes whether it's flood, snowstorm, or freezing rain, there's reasons that the highway from Schreiber to Sault Ste. Marie or to Thunder Bay isn't working. We won't get sidetracked into bridge failures in Nipigon or anything like that. But also, I think growing your own food is a lot of fun. And we can certainly have delightful times with getting our own food. And I'm still in awe of taking these tiny, tiny specks of seeds and putting them into soil and somehow getting something that is thousands, even millions of times bigger than what I put in the ground in the first place. I'm thinking about a carrot seed, for example. So let's talk about some of the advantages of northern gardening. And one of them is certainly our sunlight and long duration of light in the growing season. We're also pretty distant from many of the pests that give problems in places like Southern Ontario, the Midwest of the United States. And we have, naturally, we have a lot of pollination, whether it's black flies or bees, wild bees, and so on. And we're also very fortunate that our rainy season coincides with our growing season. If you go out to the valleys in BC, you'll find that's a very different situation where they're very dependent on irrigation. There's the heat of summer, and they need to irrigate all those crops. Otherwise, they won't have any production. So that's the good news. Limitations, and I think this is pretty obvious. We have cool temperatures. The growing season itself is fairly short. And sometimes we have problems with soils, maybe too much clay, sometimes too much sand. But as I bet all of you know, over time, you modify your soil conditions and make them more suitable for what you're doing. So still dwelling on the disadvantages we have. This is a map of the annual frost-free period in Canada. And it's not so distinct in the slide, but the green areas are areas where the growing season probably is long enough to get most production. So it's more than 120 days. But you'll see in the West Coast, we have some of that in BC, little specks here across the country, and then again in Southern Ontario and the Maritimes. Not so much visible in right around Lake Superior, because all of these places like Schreiber, Terrace Bay, Thunder Bay are generally our growing season, our frost-free season is less than 120 days. Mm-hmm. So this is from the old book. It's dated around the year 2000, and it has the different growing zones in Canada. And these, they vary, and I think you're all pretty familiar with this, but you'll see that there's this inconvenient boundary around northern Lake Superior in particular, where we're in theory, in the old days, we're limited to one or two zones of growing. But here's an interesting change that I noted when I was revising the book. Here's the next, what's happening more recently. you'll see that if we look at the compared to the two charts there, we've gained a full zone. So it's typically in the 3 zone now for northern Lake Superior and around Thunder Bay and a little more. And this is true across most of Canada. So what this means is that we have a little more flexibility in our growing, what we're trying to grow. And for example, just an example around Thunder Bay, if we go back 30 years, you don't see a lot of corn in the fields. Yet in the summertime and the growing seasons, that's fairly typical now, the last, say, 5-10 years. And my contention is if you utilize your location and create your own little climate area, you can gain another zone or another 2 or 3, even 3 zones of growing. So you have a fair amount of possibilities of growing different vegetables. And maybe in the discussion later on, we'll talk about what you have introduced as gardeners in the last 5, 10, 15 years in your garden, where it wasn't possible in the past. In my own personal experience in gardening, I lived in a rural area near Thunder Bay, and I asked a neighbor, what can you grow? And they said, well, it's pretty hopeless because you can't grow tomatoes. Yes, you can grow carrots, but the clay bakes so hard you can't get the carrots out of the ground. So fortunately for me, I didn't let that defer my gardening. And you can grow. You can successfully, you can do tomatoes, various root crops, and other specialized vegetables. And if you're cautious and a little work at it, you can grow melons like cantaloupe and peppers and so on. So keep in mind as I'm talking, there's ways to gain a 1 or 2 or even 3 zones of growing where we live. It's a close-up of the situation where we live, Thunder Bay, Schreiber, and the North Shore. Okay, let's talk about, and it's a mix of good news and bad news. We'll talk about Schreiber specifically. I've noted the Latin long of Schreiber and a couple of notes about this is old information for a couple of reasons. One is that they closed the weather station in Schreiber in a long time ago, 1975. I think that was mistaken to do that, but for a number of different places. They did it to save money, and I think it's a false saving, but nevertheless, that's what happened. So based on 20th century information, the average last frost in the spring was May 29th, and the first frost in the fall was in the middle of September, 14th of September. So that means if you do the math, you have on average, you have 108 days of growing. And as I pointed out, that's less than 120, of course. But the variability in Northern Ontario, how long the growing season can be or how short is really astonishing. We've had frost as late as July 3rd in Schreiber. And also we've had frost as early as August 3rd in, of course, this didn't happen the same year, but it means it's a really short growing season sometimes. At the bottom, I've noted that it varies from 58 to 129 days in the good years. So one of my areas of interest and how I combine interest in gardening and weather is how to avoid frost. And that's a big consideration, as I'm sure you know. This diagram here illustrates three different situations. On the left-hand side, we have daytime heating. Our sun is up there shining down directly on the land and heating up, or through clouds. So some gets reflected, some reaches the ground. So daytime heating will heat up the surface layer in our garden. However, if we have a clear night, you can see some of these arrows here are disappearing into space. This is heat being radiated from your garden surface. If we have a cloud cover, that heat will be trapped to some extent. Some will escape, but I'm sure you all have recognized when you have a cloudy night, it doesn't cool off as quickly or as much as if you have a clear night and a lot of heat radiating all night. So the right-hand side is the maybe a nice night to observe stars and the moon, but your garden, if the temperature is critically close to frost, will probably freeze in that kind of situation. So let's talk about critical temperatures. And I have some tomato grimacing on the left-hand side there. If the temperature gets down to 0 or -2, you're going to have damage and probably loss of things like tomatoes, peppers, and other sensitive crops. And it's a little worse than that, because if the temperature goes below 5 degrees, the little thermometer to the immediate right there, you're going to have tomatoes, peppers, and other sensitive plants going into shock. Now, the closer it gets to freezing, or if it goes to -1, the more these plants will be in shock. There's ways to alleviate this that I'll get to in a minute. But if you just leave those plants alone, they're going to be damaged, even if they don't get killed. If the temperature goes down to 0, so you don't actually have a frost, you're going to have the plants that are recovering, taking a day or two to recover from the shock, because it was close to 0 and freezing. And on the right-hand side, we have another critical temperature we don't have to face as often, but it's also important too. It's 30 degrees. If you're a tomato, you shut down any kind of process in that situation. So one of the problems with places like Southern Ontario, Iowa, where the temperatures often are at 30 and higher, the plants go into shock and they shut down. They don't grow in those kind of conditions. So what to do with if you have a potential frost or even a temperature going below 5 degrees? And this is your judgment call. If you have on the forecast and the temperature is forecast to go down to +6, I would think, oh, maybe I'm going to watch a little more carefully, because maybe the forecast is out by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees. So if the temperature threatened to go, if I judge at sunset that the temperature is going to go below 5 degrees, I'll set out to cover things. You have two examples here. One is the greenhouse on the left-hand side, and your crops should be okay in that kind of situation. But in a more portable situation, you have on the right-hand side, you have a way illustrated to cover and protect from frost or really cold night protection. So that polyethylene over on the right will trap the heat. It'll work something like a cloud layer. You'll have that heat that is being radiated from the ground staying in that enclosure. And that's good. It's not foolproof, but it's certainly good for 2 degrees, 3 degrees of extra temperature to protect those crops. Not everything is covered in that diagram there, because other things like lettuce, carrots, they probably don't appreciate the temperature going down to -1 or 0, but they won't be damaged by it, like our sensitive warm weather crops are. Okay, other good and interesting news. This is a diagram illustrating what's changed over the decades with the growing season temperature. This is an average of all temperatures from May to September. That sort of captures our growing season, about 5 months, or probably closer to 4 or 4.5 months in there. But you can see in Thunder Bay, I don't have the data for Scriber, but it's probably fairly similar. There's been a big change over the decades in the annual or the growing season temperature over these decades. So it's more than a degree warmer than it used to be. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you average the kind of heat units you get for growth, it's a great deal. It's a bigger number. It means that your crops, your tomatoes, your lettuce, anything it is, will grow much more than it would have been in, say, the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And what else has changed? Well, this is a little complicated because one of the things about precipitation, as I'm sure you know, it is not some kind of linear thing that you start and get generous amounts of rainfall through the growing season. It doesn't work like that. So we have huge variation in the amount of precipitation we get in the year and also in the growing season. So this illustrates, I'll start at the bottom because we're not in the snow season anymore, but we may as well start and talk about that. You can see the whiteness at the bottom of this figure. We have a slight decline over the decades with the amount of snowfall we get in the summertime, in the wintertime. Now, that doesn't always work. We get giant snowfalls occasionally, but in average, we get less snow than we used to have. That means a couple of things, probably less clearing and shoveling snow, but also we don't have the surplus of precipitation in the form of snow in the early spring that we used to, on average. The other ones are the amount of, the dark blue is the amount of rainfall, and that's accelerated over time. And the top one is the total precipitation, snow and rain combined. So most of northwestern Ontario have increases in precipitation in the form of rainfall, less snow, but rain and total precipitation, because there's a lot more rain than there used to be. This is not all a good news story, because a lot of our rain now comes in heavier rain events. To use a simple illustration of why this is a little complicated, and even though we have more rainfall in the summertime, we also have typically more fire danger. And the reason is that our rainfall comes in bigger amounts than it used to. We used to, if you go back to the benign or gentler decades of the middle 20th century, we used to average about 25 millimeters or an inch of precipitation a week in the growing season. That's great. If you got that every month, every week, you wouldn't have to water your garden much at all. But that's not the way it happens. And a simple example is if, say, June 1st, we get 100 millimeters of rain on day one, a lot of that is going to run off somewhere. into Lake Superior, likely, eventually. But if we get no more rain for the month of June, we have a drought situation by the end of it. We also have a fire danger too, but certainly our garden will be in some trouble. And the difference, I'll stress, is that we get heavier rain events than we used to. So I've alluded or stated some things about climate change, that we have another growing zone additional in our gardens on average. So we have longer growing season, and typically we have fewer frost days, but we have more droughts in the summertime. And I don't always stress this because our heat waves are not that pronounced, but we do statistically have more hot days. Mostly that's to our advantage if we have precipitation going along with it. But again, I'll mention the intense precipitation events that are not as so beneficial. And we have more intense storms, more frequent hail. And one of the problems we face in more recent decades is we have changing flora and fauna. We have deer that you didn't used to be in the vicinity. We have wood ticks that used to not exist around Lake Superior. So we have problems, and we have other invasive kind of situations. We didn't used to have Colorado potato beetle around Lake Superior as a function of our cooler climate. Now we do, not all the time, but sometimes we do now. So I think this is familiar with all of you. And a lot of people, a lot of communities are doing a lot more gardening than used to be the case. Maybe I should restate that. If we go back to the 40s, 50s, it used to be very common for people to have backyard gardens. There weren't many community gardens, but certainly people gardened a fair amount in Schreiber and other communities. That went out of fashion, not totally, but it went out of fashion in the affluent 60s, 70s. Why would you bother having a garden if you can just go to Safeways or Metro or some other supermarket and buy all your vegetables there? Why would you waste your time gardening in your backyard? So that was a bit of a lull in gardening for some people, not everybody. But now gardening has made a huge comeback, and especially related to what's happening with the pandemic last year and this year also. There's a lot more interest in growing one's own food for various reasons, one of them being food security. So I'll pause there, and I'm hoping people can relay some of their experience. And if it fits into what I described, maybe you can grow more easily some crops and vegetables that you couldn't grow in the past. So let's hand it over to general discussion. So you tell me and the other people what you've been doing, and I'll try to supplement that if I can.
With our garlic, we were all going to pull ours, but there was a woman on there that said, you can leave it and let it grow. Don't pull it all out and let it grow, because it would be, you get a larger clove. So that was something we learned at our last meeting.
Wow. I was surprised to see mine up. I put it in a wood, I put the garlic in a wooden box, like a wooden tray with soil. There's a box my dad had made for the quad, and I wasn't using it anymore. So I put soil in that and planted my garlic. So it's up about 3 inches already. So I was really surprised.
How about chives?
Hopefully it grows.
Well, it's a good start. And one of the good things about garlic and chives and onions is that they're cold resistant. If it does freeze, it's not great, but they won't die.
Okay, good to know.
So I have a question. Because I live at White Sand Lake, and really as soon as June hits, the flies are crazy and I don't want to be outside. So I tend to put my garden in all the time right by the end of May. And of course, everybody says, no, 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 you can't plant until the last frost and yada, yada, yada. But so the question is, if they're just seeds under the ground, they're not really going to be affected. As long as the earth is warm, they're not going to be affected that badly by frost, are they?
That's correct. The frost, if and when we have a frost, will not penetrate more than a few millimeters below the ground. It'll be the actual, you'll see frost literally on the ground, but you won't have frost going down to where the seeds are. So even if they germinated, it won't be an issue unless they're, and most things like lettuce, if it's above the ground, that's okay. And if it's not above the ground, it's not an issue.
Graham, what
Okay, that's
about
kind of what I
planting
always-
around the moon cycles?
Okay.
Yeah, but
What are
again,
your thoughts on that? Oh, sorry.
Okay. I think it's nonsense. Okay. And to illustrate this to myself, I went through about 20 years of full moons, new moons, first quarter, last quarter, and tried to find any connection with temperature. And I didn't find one. Now, and think about back to that diagram I showed you of what happens if we don't have cloud cover. The heat of the earth will radiate off into space. And if you often, for about a week, you can see something like, it looks more or less like a full moon. It's not. And if you try this yourself, mark what happened with the temperature with the full moon on the calendar. I'm not talking about whether you can see the moon or not, but if you, I did this seriously as a project, and there was no connection. There was no magic moon visible and sucking heat out of the earth. It doesn't happen that way. And also think about what would happen if that were the actual case. You would have, every time there's a full moon around anywhere in the world, you would have this incredible transfer of heat. It doesn't happen because we have clouds and clear skies moving across our landscape all the time. So I think if you sometimes it could be coincidentally okay. Maybe the last full moon is on the Victoria Day weekend, and you wait till then and plant things. That would work out fine by coincidence. But if you have if you wait for the last full moon in June, you cut your growing season substantially. And again, I ask people to keep track of the full moon and what the temperature was. Yes, sometimes it'll be cold, you'll have problem conditions when there is a full moon, but it's not because of the full moon. It's because you don't have cloud cover.
I have a question.
Yes.
A lot of people in Scriber now have problems growing carrots because we get bad bugs in. Yeah, I see a lot of heads shaking there. And have you got a help for us?
Yeah, that's a problem. If only it were confined to Scriber. I think it's much more widespread and not. Fortunately, in our soil, we don't have that problem, but I'm fairly familiar with how widespread it is in Thunder Bay and other locations. And I don't have a magic solution because I haven't experimented because I don't have the problem. But you could consider a couple of experiments. One is to take wood ashes and scatter it in the vicinity of the carrots. Not too much, and not any old ashes, but these should be pure wood ashes, not cardboard and printed paper and things like that. So that would be introducing toxins into your soil. So that's, I think, one thing to try for a few different remedies. There's other things like cutworms. And if you have a little, I'm talking about really a small ridge of these ashes, not a lot. And that will deter, I hope, the problem with the carrots, but also slugs and other things that crawl on the ground will be discouraged by having a little mound of ashes that they have to go through. So how about other people? Any other remedies?
Graham, I live in the city of Thunder Bay, and I put in planter boxes last year for the first time and added new soil. I didn't have trouble with the problem with the carrots, the worm in the carrots last year, but the year before that, I did have that problem. So I don't know what the answer is. But the other day I went out and dug the soil in my planter boxes and I don't have any worms. And I'm wondering if I should be concerned about that.
I don't think it's a disaster, but it would be preferable if you did. Do you have other soil that you could grab a few worms from?
I guess I'd have to look for it.
Maybe it's a new business for somebody. I don't know.
Maybe.
There was a time that I think in Scribe, somebody was selling worms for the garden to get it working better.
That's right, and raising worms too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if anybody has tried. This is if there's other discussion and questions, we can go there. But I'm wondering if anybody's. You mentioned that the garlic can stay over the winter in the ground. So can carrots as well. It's a little touch and go, and you have to mulch like crazy because the carrots can make it through the winter and be quite firm, or they can be mush. And the reason they would be mush is because they go through freeze, thaw a few times, and that reduces them to something it's not possible to eat. But you can certainly. I've done this off and on. I don't always. And one time the first time I guess I lucked out because I mulched the carrots a little bit, but then it snowed a lot and the temperature remained very uniform but below the snow. So the carrots that I had more or less missed in the harvest in the year, the summer before, made it through the winter. This works a little bit with beets, not as well, but it works a little bit. And parsnips works fairly well. You can have, what it means is that you have vegetables first thing in the spring. As soon as you can get rid of the snow and dig up the carrots, obviously the ground is thawed, then you have a few things to eat in the springtime. So no reason to think about that right now, but if you have a lot of carrots, for example, and they're doing pretty well in say in September, October, and you can also leave them in the ground for quite a while, probably as late as November, and then you'll have a choice if you have unlikely, but if you have too many carrots and you can't cope with them harvesting them all, try a little experiment of putting a straw or mulch on top of them and hoping you get a snowfall to cover them.
I tried mulching celery. I had read that sometimes it would winter over, but it was pretty mushy. So I think maybe it had too much frost and thaw. And, mhm.
Yeah, I've never tried it. I guess I'll try that after.
Mhm.
It should be possible, but it's a risky thing.
Mhm.
But if you have more carrots than you can deal with, why not try it? Because they'll taste as good or better than the carrots that you'll be eating out of the garden in August or September, because they set up more sugars over the winter time.
Mhm. Well, when I first moved to this area, I was so disappointed at how short the growing season was. People could grow corn in greenhouses, but it was a little more difficult to grow them outside. And some people were able to grow melons and cantaloupe, but of course they were in cold frames, and some of the peppers did better inside the greenhouses as well. But I think that's changing a bit. I mean, I find that the nights aren't as cold. I think that's a big difference that I've noticed in our area. And also, too, it's always amazing to see when the seeds are in the ground, just how fast they'll do what they need to do to, get through to the fall. So, yeah, just the difference in acceleration and growth, because things are a little bit shorter in the growing season. That's always interesting to see.
Yeah, and Donna, that takes it back to the slide I talked about our advantages. Our sunlight is better. This sounds like I'm bragging about something I shouldn't. But our air quality is better than you'll find in Southern Ontario or Ohio and places like that. We have more direct sunlight because there's not as much pollution in the air. And also we have more duration of sun and light in the summertime than they do in. I'm not trying to badmouth Southern Ontario, but we do have, when we compare, we have some advantages because we are farther north and our air is better.
Graham,
Yes.
if I want to go back to leaving vegetables in the ground, that prevents me from tilling the soil and adding my old leaves that have been mulched up and other nutrients in preparation for the following spring. Or I often add a bit of lime and some wood ash and till that in. So leaving those vegetables in the ground prevents me from doing some things that I think are advantageous to my garden soil, especially when you think of living in a boreal soil.
So when do you supplement your soil with mulch and lime? Is that
I usually do that. I usually do that in the fall.
Okay. Well, I'm not suggesting that vast areas should be devoted to taking a gamble with carrots over wintering. I'm not suggesting that at all. But if you want to have a little bit of an experiment, take a little section of row. I'm talking about, this is an experiment, not a real practice. I wouldn't convert 5 rows of carrots into a gamble whether they make it through the winter, because sometimes they won't. But I might take a couple of meters of carrots that just for fun to see what happens. And once they get through the winter, you dig them up and you can till your soil and do anything that you wish to. So I don't think, unless you get carried away with this idea, I don't think it would hurt much. How about basil? Does anybody try to grow basil?
Only in the greenhouse.
Yeah, that's right. We grow it outside, although it's we have a whole system of being able to cover basil, tomatoes, and so on. But it's even more sensitive to cold than tomatoes. If you you don't want it to happen, but if you have the temperature goes down to -1, probably your tomatoes will survive. But if it goes down to -1 and basil, you'll probably lose that entirely. I should mention something about temperature. I maybe have talked about temperature too much already, but there's different kinds of, I mentioned 5 degrees. If it's predicted to be less than 5 degrees, your warm crops are going to have problems. They'll go into shock. But it's a little more complicated than that, because when we're talking about the forecast temperature going down to, say it goes down to 4, it's predicted to be that. That's measuring the temperature almost 2 meters above the ground, your eye height. And the temperature between that point, the official temperature at airports and other places, and the actual ground can be very different. So you've heard of a ground frost. And if you look at the temperature, you say, wait a minute, it's not really 0. It may be 3 degrees, but you can see a dusting of frost on the ground. It's the cooling off of the temperature at the ground is major, and even 2 meters above, it doesn't cool off as much. So you get what's called a ground frost. And I bet everybody has seen this on a cold morning in the spring or in the fall. You can see a bit of frost on your garage or a neighbor's rooftop. The temperature will cool off at any surface. So you'll have the temperature between your garage top and your house top. You'll see a little frost on both those places. In between those places is not freezing. It's only because it's a surface, so that the heat radiates from a surface. Now, that's why covering your garden is so effective, because you're putting in another surface. You're just you're making that the polyethylene or a newspaper or whatever you use to cover with will become very cold, but what's below it won't cool off anywhere as much. So I'm guessing people have seen that, what I'm talking about, that you think, oh, there's frost on the rooftop, it must be a disaster in the garden. It could be, but if you have done other things to supplement your garden design, say you have a slope. Ideally, it would be a slope to the south, and then your cold air is going to drain downhill. And it's not going to get anywhere near as cold as it would if it was a flat surface, a little plateau in your garden.
The other interesting feature of temperature is this whole thing of being cooler by the lake. And we've noticed how our garden here at Sealam differs significantly from gardens up at White Sand and in Scriber, which are further away from the lake.
In the fall time, it's warmer by the lake, right?
Yes, it is. But to get things started and to get things growing early in the season, it's always that big air conditioner just to the south of me, as you know, Graham.
That's right.
Thank
Yes,
you.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah. I thought that observation would come up today, and I should have included a slide talking about it, but I'll try to do it verbally. In preparation or thinking about today, I was thinking, would it be possible to put some kind of small barrier that would deflect the lake breezes coming off the lake. Now, you don't want to shade the sun is to your south, so you don't want to cut off the sunshine. But if you had some kind of barrier between your garden where it is and the lake, and the breeze would come over and be deflected up over the barrier and then descend somewhere else beyond your garden, we hope. If I were right on the lake, I would try to experiment with that.
Well, Graham, I just had a thought. If anyone's interested in purchasing your new book or your revised book, can they contact you, or where would they be available?
Well, I think they're available in Scriber now, aren't they?
Well, there's some are available in Scriber, yes.
Yeah.
But there are some Thunder Bay folks here, so.
That's right. They are at the moment, they're in Roots to Harvest. They have a number of copies there. And just for fun, they're at a place called East Coast Lobster, which is a fish store in the south part of the city, sort of near the airport. It's a mall there. So I have, I'm not sure whether fish buyers are the same people who buy gardening books. We'll find out. But there's been a couple have been sold already. So there's a couple locations. Maybe I can send you an email when there's more locations available. They used to be available, as you know, COVID-19 changes a lot of things. We don't have people have browsing through bookstores so much anymore. And they used to be at the Lakehead University Library or bookstore. They were available there, and a few other places in the city. I just picked up the last run of the new print today, so I still have to find places that they'll be sold. They're going to be at the Stanley Fair, although that's too late for this growing season to be of much use. And there'll be a couple of other places where they're available in Thunder Bay. But certainly Roots to Harvest has many of them, many copies.
Graham, I'm going to say this was one of our most helpful tools from the book, the original. And that was the whole thing about companion planting. And
Yes,
what follows what and what goes best with what. That's been an invaluable tool.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And it's I didn't delete it. It's still there. There's a few. So what I did is went through page by page and revised things that I thought needed updating. And there's a few major changes that I don't have the comparison that I showed you today of the old growing zone map with the new one. I just put in the new one. You'll have to take my word for it or find an old edition. But I think that's a huge change. And I think Donna just alluded to that we have more choices now than we used to. Yes. Because of that change in climate. So thanks for mentioning the companion cropping, and it's a busy page. There's a lot of information on it, but I like to think that it's fairly readable and understandable. If you want to know what carrots should be near or not near, you just go to that page and look it up and apply it.
It's always fascinating how that works. You really kind of wonder about the biochemistry between plants.
Yes, and I haven't investigated that so carefully, just applying that what I've read, but also what I've applied. If I tried, well, I was going to say onions and carrots, they do okay together in the same proximity, but there's other things that are not so successful. And it makes a difference. And if we add up all these little differences, For example, if we can just change the slope of our garden or have a channel of cold air draining by your garden. For example, at the edge of the perimeter of our garden, we have a little trench that runs north-south on both sides. It's there for two reasons. One is to stop weed invasions and also provide drainage. Three reasons, actually. Drainage, because sometimes if you get too much rain, you don't want a watered garden. So I have weeping tile around the garden that if there's too much rain, the water will go somewhere else. And if there's enough rain, it just stays where it's supposed to. But also the same trench will work to funnel cold air by the garden. And air is just like a liquid. If you imagine you had a bucket of water and you threw it on the garden, the air will act in a similar fashion. It'll drain in places where you probably don't want it to drain. And mostly I would locate warm seeking plants like tomatoes at the top of the garden if I had a north to south slope, which I do. And so the cold air, it's going to be colder at the base of the garden in that circumstance. There's several diagrams in the book about this. And it illustrates it much more than I can do in talking about it today. But if you can design your planting to pick up a little bit more warmth, we're talking about a degree or even a half a degree. But if you add up all these half degrees and full degrees, you have a lot more growth potential, heat units that go into your plants and vegetables.
We can all remember our grandparents having the garden and going out and helping them, mostly because they had to. If you didn't grow your own potatoes, you just wouldn't have them. So I was just wondering, is there something that is generational about gardening that seems to push it up and down? And have you noticed any real interest from youth, especially for gardening?
I think that is a big change, and I wouldn't be able to explain it all, but and I'm not sure. Maybe I hope it's disobeying the generation leap, because we certainly had that, as you just talked about. People in the old days grew potatoes because that's it. They're going to grow their own, or they won't have them. And then it became so easy to get all this garden produce in a timely manner. And then more recently, we've had going back the other way. But I think I know a lot of people in my age group, or approximately, and their kids are interested in, they're not missing a generation, I don't think. But it would be probably more, or at least accentuated by younger people being mostly more aware of their world they're in, and things like hedging your bets. You want food security. And I think as over time, this will become more and more of an issue that will have, we have more demand because of COVID, and we're sending our crops to so-and-so place, not to Scriber, because it's not worth our shipping it, those kind of things. I think that is one of the things that we'll have more in the future. I'm not guaranteeing that, and I don't want that, but I think it's best to sort of hedge one's bets, that you have enough food coming out of your own situation, which is better anyway. So I think it'll be a fair amount of momentum. Certainly, there's a lot more community gardens than there used to be.
That's interesting, because one of the objectives with the community garden, Little Sprouts Community Garden, was it was a joint partnership with early on, or early years. It's gone through a couple of name changes. And so, there are families with children on 5 and under, and we partnered and primarily put together the garden through volunteers and a grant as well. And it was really great to see the generations, like grandparents and grandchildren, working in the garden together over the years. So that was bridging the gap there, and encouraging, connection with the ground, planting with each other, networking. And it's been an amazing experience. We just finished putting together 6 new garden boxes, because there are a lot of seniors now that have, a little bit of trouble gardening. So this will make it a lot easier for them. And it keeps growing, and it's, just wonderful to see that, because, there is a lot of learning and connecting and social interaction, and it's just a win-win all around. So I certainly would like to see more of that in our communities, that kind of connection and helping one another.
I think on a personal note, I have a daughter that's doing some gardening, and if it's not just a teaching tool for my grandson, her concern is pesticides and stuff that is used on food that maybe people aren't aware of, that's being used when they're buying these foods in the grocery stores. And I think in her instance, she's really concerned with that. And if it comes out of her own garden, she knows exactly what it's grown in, how it's looked after.
Yeah, precisely. I don't know whether you'll laugh at us or not, but we have good compost and bad compost. It's a sort of an in-joke between my wife and I, Kirsten. But if we, in the wintertime, we do buy food from supermarkets and things like that, but the waste product, the peels and everything else, go into a different compost than what we take from our own garden.
Wow.
Say carrot tops, they go into the good compost. I'm not that locked onto values and good and bad, but you get the point. I think that's very important to know what went into your soil, what came out of your garden, and probably it's almost guaranteed that's going to be better quality than what you're going to buy in a store. It may be, and I'm not bad-mouthing organic produce that you buy in a supermarket, but it's not as guaranteed as what you grow in your own garden.
For my family, being of Italian descent, they came from Italy. A lot of the produce that they were growing wasn't available, and it isn't really all that mainstream now. Like you can see little bunches of Swiss chard, or even the different kinds of beans. I know most people are, growing green beans, string beans, yellow beans. We want the broader beans, of still tender, pole type. We stew them with potatoes. We put them on top of pasta. So it's a whole ethnic thing where we're growing what we use, or that we use on a day-to-day basis, and what I want. Like I'm not as successful with my Swiss chard as my uncle is in Thunder Bay. So it's not unheard of for me to go with a black garbage bag and fill it, bring it home, process it, and then it goes into the freezer. So there was no fear of COVID food shortage at the Carlino house. Push comes to shove, you just dig a little deeper in that freezer.
As we're talking about generations and things, I was thinking of my grandfather. He used to always grow sunflowers. Is that a pretty easy thing to do? I'm thinking maybe I should take a corner of the yard and maybe throw some sunflower seeds out there, just thinking of my grandfather. Maybe that could be my first step into gardening.
Well, sure. I think they're relatively easy to grow, and you should, I don't know what I'm going to say if you don't have success, Kim, but I think it's a good thing to start with and do another experiment or two just for fun.
So again, on behalf of the library and the senior center and the Scriber Media Center, thank you everyone for joining us, and hopefully we'll be able to connect again with more sessions. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thank you.